to be here and really honoured. So, like Pete said, a bit of an analogy, similarity to Anthony there. We've looked at outside the sporting context and said, can we draw some inspiration from the military groups and their selection process to look for elite groups? So, as you've heard today, there is a long history of talent identification in Australia, over 25 years, and the really dominant method of talent identification in Australia has been on the physiological side, physiology, and the physical anthro side. And it's not because people in Australia don't know about the other factors. This 3D athlete development model clearly outlines factors related to the daily training environment, the coaching, the psychological characteristics of the athlete. It's just that it's so difficult to actually assess in your selection process some of the other aspects to do with psychology that we tend to avoid it a little bit, and if we have in the past included it, has been more of an exploratory way of looking perhaps through some psychological inventories or considering it in the talent confirmation process and how people are adapting and what they're showing, rather than including it fairly early on in the selection process. So there is a lot of evidence, as we've heard, that some of the psychological characteristics of athletes can really differentiate between those who are successful and non-successful. Characteristics like resilience, hardiness, determination, intrinsic motivation. There's lots and lots of factors that have been shown. And some recent research by Beck Dickinson at the University of Queensland that's recently been going on, is about to be published, showed that particularly in talent transfer, it can really make or break the relationship between somebody coming into a program and actually making it out the other side. Because in talent transfer, they're really being thrown in the deep end, normally straight into an elite program, and they've got the challenge of having previously been at a very good level in their sport and having to go right back down to the beginner stages and being like a fish out of water. So in talent transfer in particular, those psychological characteristics could be very important. There's another group in Australia and all around the world who've really been refining their selection processes to try and get an elite group of people into their organisation in a psychological and a physical way. And that's the military special forces. So there's actually been some research done that's focused on that characteristic of hardiness. And hardiness is a term which basically characterises someone as able to handle the adversities that life's thrown at them and to perceive a stressor in their life as actually a positive thing rather than a negative thing that breaks them. So there's been a couple of papers that have differentiated those successful soldiers who've gone through and made it through this Special Forces selection course as being more hardy than those who don't make it. So I think it's probably relevant to talk a little bit about what do those Special Forces selection courses involve and how do we find that those people who make it through have those characteristics of hardiness. Well, Special Forces is normally the most elite groups in the military, and their selection courses tend to be about 3 or 4 weeks of hell, basically, and they put their soldiers through a series of challenges which are actually very carefully designed and very carefully refined over the last 50 years to challenge their soldiers in a multi-dimensional way. So they're looking at their physical abilities, their skill abilities in some very specific job challenges, and their psychological characteristics about how they approach challenges, not just whether they get through the challenge and can physically do it. So we wanted to see if we can apply that methodology in a sporting context and get that same sort of multi-dimensional outcome. So I'm going to talk to you about a project that we did last year and just framing it for a couple of research questions. So using Special Forces selection methodology, if we do that in a sporting scenario, is it the physical or psychological traits that discriminate between those who get selected and those who don't get selected? We can retrospectively look back at some of our data and say what differentiated those athletes. And secondly, can you apply a Special Forces selection methodology, adapt it for use in sport? Does it work, and what are the outcomes that you get? So last year, the AIS launched a program called the AIS Sports Draft, which is a talent transfer program which each year is going to move on to a different cluster of sports and really put a focus on getting some new talent transfer talent into those areas. This first year, I worked with combat sports, and we targeted 2 sports in the combat sport domain, boxing and judo. And very quickly, we, having consulted with the coaches involved in these sports, it sort of reinforced to us the very important nature of the psychological aspect of who we're picking. These are some of the things they said instantly when we said, what are we looking for? Alongside the skill of the physical stuff, they said stuff like self-discipline, determination, killer instinct, resistant to failure psychologically, prepared to experience pain, prepared to commit to making weight, and that generic term, mental toughness. So we already knew it's important, but we particularly know for these sports, it is important because you are going to get hit in the face and you are probably going to get thrown on your head, and it is going to hurt. So it's very important. So in our selection process, what we wanted to try and do was, at the very early stages of selection, make it multidimensional. So we wanted to try and get athletes who were high on the fitness domain, high on the psychology domain in terms of what we're looking for, high, good character, good attitude, and they might have moderate skill, and then the aim of our development program is to accelerate that skill development so that we have, hopefully, a well-rounded athlete in the end. So how did we do this? So we advertised nationally in Australia for people who were interested in this opportunity. We used social media, we also used conventional media, all sorts of trying to reach athletes out there. And we set quite a broad age range. We said 15 to 27, we'll test you. And what we did is we had about 250 applicants, and we screened out those people who already had too much boxing and too much judo experience, because in our view, they've already competed in their sports, they're already in the system, and they should be succeeding on their own. I mean, that doesn't necessarily always work, but that was our view for this project. So in the physical screening phase, we tested 8 centres around Australia. We did a whole variety of tests that we felt would give us some indications of their all-round ability. So we did 20-metre sprint for explosive power and speed. We did vertical jump, the multi-stage fitness test, which is the big test. Core strength, we modified a test that we've seen used internationally, so that was a bit more experimental. We used the seated med ball throw, and we made that relative med ball throw result, so we standardised it for height, so we got rid of that height and lever length factor. We did 60-second push-ups for general upper body strength, and we actually created, we used some contacts that we had with some Japanese scientists about the agility test they do in Japan, because it was relatively new to us, and gave that a go. And we created the 4-variable index from 3 of the most well-known tests. We know the ability, we know the reliability of the sprint, the vertical jump, and also fitness test, and we were confident in the reliability of the 60-second push-ups. Try and get an overall value for which allowed us to quantify and say how we're going to choose these people to move on. So we classified those athletes, scored them on a sort of cumulative basis. We picked those who basically scored the top 20% for men and women in those scores. And we then looked at anybody who stood out particularly on one of the tests in particular, who was exceptional on the test, invited them along. We also looked at data relative to height and weight, so anybody who was actually outstanding for their height or for their weight or for their age. And we had the coaches at the selection as well to give us some perspectives on their movement skill and a very basic judo and boxing experience they had. So this second stage of testing was actually the Special Forces methodology section. So we invited 37 athletes to a centralised testing camp, and during that camp what we actually did is we designed activities that were like boxing or like judo, trying to get at some of the aspects of boxing and judo movement skill and skill learning capacities that we felt were important. And the other kind of thing we actually had during those days were activities that were deliberately tough and deliberately challenging, deliberately confrontational, so that the coaches and us scientists could actually just observe and see how do these people react, what do they show us about themselves and their behaviours, and can we get some idea of what they'd be like in a training scenario based on their behaviours. So I'm just going to show you, one other thing is that we have some great contacts from the Australian Defence Force who really helps with the design of this and actually the implementation. So at the camp we had one particular guy who's an ex-Special Forces commando. He's done 7 tours of Afghanistan and really works in this space to look at how you can really work on athletes' characters. And we had some actual serving members of the SASR come along to help us with the testing. So we did have a very military flavour. I'm just going to show you a little video of the camp, if I can. No. So this should give you a little flavour as to those kind of skill and character activities. So I think you can see it was pretty coach-led. There was a lot of modified boxing and judo activities, and that sort of boot camp style, that boot camp aspect was certainly to try and get an idea of how people react under pressure. The other thing we did at this camp was we actually collected some data on some psychological characteristics, some psychological inventory, so that we could then retrospectively go back and have a look at these athletes. But we didn't use this information for selection, it was 100% observation. And we've now got 12 athletes who were selected from that program, now doing a one-year fast-track entry into boxing and judo. So just in terms of how we can actually go back and look at that data, we had 5 athletes who during the camp were unfortunately injured or ill. We had 12 athletes who moved on and 20 athletes who weren't selected at the camp. And so first thing we wanted to do is see how those groups were different on some of the physical and psychological data we had for them. And we did a very exploratory, very preliminary, very exploratory kind of analysis of logistic regression to try and see, is there a way of using some of those tests to actually differentiate between the groups? We're very aware that we have low subject numbers, so it's certainly exploratory and doesn't really tell us too much, but I'll share the results with you. So these are the test results. These are the physical test results only, and they're quantified as Z-scores. So that's a 0 Z-score is the mean of the group, and +1 or -1 would be 1 standard deviation, or 1 above or below. So we've got all the tests down the slide, all the Z-scores, and the 3 factors that came out as differentiated between the groups were the bent ball throw, the 60-second push-ups, and that 4-variable index, which was a bit of a whole body fitness indicator. So those groups, in those measures, the selected group was scored better than the non-selected group. But this graph shows that kind of individual variation that Sam was talking about, and the kind of analysis you might want to do, where if you look on the med ball throw, which was our most significant difference between the group, you can see there's actually some people below the 0 line, so below group average. And if you were to just go on the physical test data alone, you would certainly lose some of those people who were selected from this process but wouldn't have been selected on their physical ability alone. So they're certainly not predictive in terms of what we found. The psychological characteristics, this was again retrospective, looking back at what were they like. We had a look at 5 different inventories and the global score. The only one that was significantly different was their coping skills. And within those scales, there were some subscales, and particularly in the coping skills subscales, these are the significantly different ones. Keeping under pressure, freedom from worry, stress minimisation in the mental toughness subscale, commitment and self-efficacy. And I think by no means are we saying that these are the ones that certainly differentiate. I think they would have a similar scatter to the physical test data, but just shows that there are some differences that emerge from that kind of process, and that there's some physical and psychological aspects of these athletes that might be differentiating them. Finally, that logistic regression. Logistic regression puts all your data into a model and works out, are there just a couple of indicators that you could use from your test results that would actually classify very successfully your groups into selected and non-selected. If you use physical alone, you correctly identify 8 out of 12, and 3 would be classified incorrectly. We actually have 1 missing data set there, that's why it's eliminated it. And you'd have 2 errors in the non-selected group. If you use just the psychological variables, you have a similar sort of success failure rate. It's not bad considering that physical variables, if it only uses med ball throw and core strength, it gets that kind of success rate, and that's the best model. And so you think that a combination, maybe use a combination, it would improve it, but actually it didn't improve it at all, and the physical variables would be still the best predictor. And so if you just use these models and say, can we actually go back and just get the same result using some paper pencil, psych inventories and some physical tests, you'd actually get 12 different athletes incorrectly classified if you use one or the other. So we feel like going through this process showed up some different things than you would actually get just from a paper pencil or a field testing inventory. But again, it's fairly unreliable stats, it's just a snapshot. Finally, second question was, so can you actually adapt it for use in your sport? Well, this really is the question of, do we feel like it's actually done a good job, and do the coaches feel like it, and do the athletes feel like it? So just some coach reflections. So one GLA coach, this is of the athletes who've now gone into the gym environments. What have those coaches said about them? So he said, my athlete's attitude towards improving her skill set are fantastic. As she goes, she sets goals to win and is willing to put in the hard work required. So another coach said about his athlete who he's received, he's an absolute workhorse, amazing attitude. And finally, this one said, I love having a sports draft athlete in my gym. His work ethic is rubbing off on the other young boxers. So at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to try and find athletes who are going to succeed in this sport. But actually what we want to do is have a very positive influence on the other athletes in the sport and the gyms that they go into. So it's really good for us to hear that, and we feel like it's as a result of really prioritising character and attitude in our selection processes. And the reflections of the athlete, I think we didn't expect this to be the case, but it seems to be that some of the athletes have told us that just going through that experience of the military-style boot camp and going through a really tough experience to get into the program has actually had a positive effect rather than just being a selection tool. So this athlete, who was really in struggle street during that testing, he said, getting through the draft has helped me understand that physical limitations to an extent can be overcome if you allow your mind to take over and push through. It's been one of the toughest challenges to be a part of, but now getting through it, I have the confidence to take on nearly any physical task within region. So it looks like it's been a learning tool as well as a selection tool. So I feel like, we're assessing it, and we're fairly biased. We did this process. We're not saying it's independent analysis, but we really feel like we succeeded in trying to include a multidimensional aspect to selection. So there's going to be reasons for selection would be physical, skill, and psychological, and each of the athletes will have different strengths in there. So we feel like it was a good way of doing it. We feel like it's got a certain amount of ecological validity in terms of the athletes, and the coach is actually feeling like these athletes have shown me in a very sport-specific way that they're worthy of selection. They've shown, the coaches have reported to us fairly independently that when these athletes have gone back to their clubs, they've been impressed by their attitude primarily. They're impressed by their physicality as well, but their attitude, their comments about the attitude have really stood out to us. And that the process of actually doing it this way could be transformational, so actually making your athletes more into the kind of athletes that you actually want through the selection process rather than just selecting them as they are. So it was a big team, it was an AOS Boxing Australia, Judo Federation Australia project, and it was very multidisciplinary. Thanks.